Welcome to people as you are filtering into the session here. We're going to start up in a couple of minutes. And in the meantime, you can listen to Al Green. Let's stay together. So I'd like to welcome you to our session today, Can the Green New Deal Go Local? My name is John Pfeffer, and I am the Director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. I also direct the Global Just Transition Project, and this event is part of our series looking at Green New Deals and similar initiatives in the United States, Europe, Asia, Africa, many countries around the world. I'll put a link to our webpage in the chat. What I'd like to do to start off is to introduce our moderator for this evening's event, and that is Rebecca Leber. And Rebecca is a climate change reporter for Vox. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Vox and perhaps with her reporting as well. Before joining Vox, she was an environmental reporter at Mother Jones, where her investigations exposed government corruption and fossil fuel industry disinformation. She has worked as a staff writer at Grist, The New Republic, and Think Progress. A dozen more outlets have published her work over her decade as a climate journalist. So I'm delighted to be here with Rebecca and to introduce her. Rebecca is going to introduce you to our other distinguished panelists, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say today. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that great introduction. I've been really excited for this discussion today because this couldn't be more timely given what's happening in Congress, but also what's happening on the local level. I think I'm excited to learn a lot about how local actions can advance the Green New Deal, but also how with this possible new Inflation Reduction Act, how that $370 billion going to climate spending can also feed into local action. So we are going to have plenty of time for questions. Encourage you all to submit comments in the chat or and also use the Q&A feature to submit questions. And we'll have time at the end for plenty of questions. So here today, we have Luis Aguirre Torres, the Director of Sustainability in Ithaca, New York, where he's leading the effort to transform the city's Green New Deal to be more effective and focused on social justice. We also have Julia Peak, the Director of Communication and Mobilization at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, and she helps improve cooperation between the federal and local level. And last but not least, we have Susie Strife, who directs and manages all of Boulder County sustainability efforts, policies, and programs with a special focus on clean energy, finance, and climate action. I have a lot of questions for all of you, but I think just to situate our panel here, I just would love to hear go down the line to explain a bit about your role and what you focus on in your community. So, Luis, why don't we start with you?
Sure, let's do that. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It is a pleasure to be with all of you. I think you are all superstars of the sustainability world, so it's kind of humbling to be part of this group. So I'm Luis. I work in the city of Ithaca. I run the sustainability office. My job is to figure out how to achieve full decarbonization by 2030, which is, this massive ambitious goal that the city has. But, it's one of those that is worth taking on because, at the end of the day, that's what we're here for. So that's what I do. That's what I do all day, all the time. It's my hobby, my passion, and, part of what I hope I will continue doing for many years to come.
Thanks, and we're going to learn a lot more about what you do throughout this panel. Julia, love to turn it over to you.
Sure. Hi. Great to be here with all of you and look forward to hearing from all the folks who are listening in, and love to hear your questions, your reflections, what you've been thinking about and working on too. So the Urban Sustainability Directors Network is a nonprofit network of sustainability practitioners from over 250 cities and counties across the US and Canada. And we're really working for transformative change to accelerate and to build equitable, resilient, and sustainable communities. So get the pleasure occasionally of working with Boulder and Ithaca, so that's really exciting, as well as, of course, many other folks, some of whom might be on the call now. And so my work is really focused on doing that, whether it's at other scales of government or with communications and engagement and stakeholder outreach. So I get to touch a lot of different pieces of this, and I can share what I've seen, and I'm also really excited to learn more on this call with all of you too.
And Susie, for you to jump in.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Rebecca and John, for hosting. This is already so fun, especially starting off with some Al Green. My name is Susie Strife. As said before, I'm the Director of Sustainability, Climate Action, and Resilience for Boulder County. And I've basically spent my entire career working on transformational solutions to the climate crisis. And so I'm really looking forward to being inspired by this great group and learning more about how the Green New Deal can actually materialize in the local government setting, because I know that local and state governments have been far ahead of the national government in institutionalizing and progressing climate action. So I'm really looking forward to learning more today. Thanks for having me.
Great. I thought we'd start with Julia here to set the stage a bit for the context of why local action matters. I think as a member of the press, we're guilty of focusing a lot on the federal level and international level when it comes to climate solutions. But I think for years now, most of that progress is happening at the more local level. I hope you could put that in context for us of why cities are taking a lead on climate and why that's such an important part of the equation when we're talking about climate solutions.
Sure, definitely. I mean, big question. I feel the pressure of kicking off and framing the conversation. I will do my best. So I think there are a lot of answers to this question. I mean, to be brief, one, obviously, as you said, is that cities have been taking the lead, and we're a huge part of progress, especially under the Trump administration. And there's a lot that cities can do, and Susie and Luis can share more about what that's looking like in their jurisdictions, which would be great to hear about. But broadly, cities are doing incredible work to make cities more energy efficient, to reduce pollution, to increase resilience to extreme weather, connecting with communities, but I think one of the pieces that is unique, that is not so much about emissions reduction, but the fact that cities are where so many programs and policies actually come alive. Like, we know what it's going to look like. Whatever's happening at the federal or the state level comes alive at the local level. Either people have clean, affordable, safe, comfortable homes, or they don't. Either they can get around their cities or they can't, right? Either their communities are safe and resilient and they have the infrastructure that they need or they don't. And so a lot of what we can see what actually is going to work and where we need to push and where policies and programs need to change, the way it comes alive at the local level. And cities can innovate and can try new things in a way that is much more difficult at the state or federal level. And again, Susie and Louise can talk more about this and the innovation that they've tested out. So I think that's a big part of it. And I know at USDN, a lot of the folks we're working with, or sustainability practitioners at all levels and all different parts of local government, are really grappling with their role. What does it mean to build sustainable, thriving communities, and are focusing a lot of that work on partnering deeply with communities and trying to repair a lot of those relationships, share power with communities, and really elevate what do communities with real lived experience and needs actually want from us, and how can we partner together to serve them in a way that is just not possible at a federal or state level. You're just too far away. And so cities have this incredible, rich relationship and fertile ground to really create the kind of world we want to see, but they also need the support and the resources to do so from the state and federal levels, which I know we'll get into more. But I think I'd start with that. Susie and Luis, other pieces you would add?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from Susie also just explaining what the role is for a sustainability or climate officer and how you've seen that change.
Yeah, I mean, Julia, thank you for that setup, because it's so true that we get to showcase what's possible in our local communities and basically pilot amazing program services, mandates, and showcase what's possible moving forward to other communities and to the feds. And so I think that that's really powerful. It's interesting, the role of the sustainability and climate officer, and Luis would probably agree, has definitely evolved in the last 2 decades, especially since I started 14 years ago. The role really traditionally started as a kind of environmental protection or natural resource protection roles, and sustainability wasn't even a term. And so the first sustainability coordinators or officers that were hired were really looking inward at how to improve operations in their own organizations, and also, help employees become more engaged in sustainability behavior. At some point, the role expanded dramatically, and it was about the entire community at large, and to provide both voluntary opportunities and regulated programs to ensure the community at large, really across the region, was acting in a more sustainable, climate-friendly way. And now what I find super transformational, and I love how we're all kind of thinking about it, and USDN has been a huge part of this, is we're really looking outward to provide our residents, businesses, our policymakers, our other stakeholders, actual models for how to act responsibly given the climate crisis, right? And how to respond resiliently in the face of climate change. And so I think today more than ever, these roles have been really instrumental, again, in showing what's possible within communities for scalable change, piloting to the state and national government what's possible as local governments, again, have been far ahead, as I mentioned before, in implementing strategies to avoid climate breakdown. And I think these roles, and it's a lot, right, have been required to deeply invest in achieving local climate goals through the direct emission reduction strategies. But then there's an entire movement to band together and to build coalitions and partnerships across, whether that's in communities or across other organizations, to leverage higher impact strategies and systems change. And so this is one way that I think sustainability offices have sort of evolved over time, whereas it once started at sort of this individual level, individual households, individual actors. Let me give an example. One way to think about this is it's one thing for a sustainability office to really provide an individual household the mandates or the resources to go solar, but it's an entirely transformational approach for those within a sustainability office to work on policy on state mandates that require utilities serving hundreds of thousands of people in their territory to derive their energy from solar or other renewables. And that's sort of a systems change now that I think we're all after. And we look to, for example, Ithaca right now for the transformational change they're making to decarbonize their economy. That's so exciting for a community like ours. And in fact, we've reached out to Louise many times to meet and learn, how did you do that, so we can do that too. And when we pan together and pull our purchasing power and pull and leverage our policymaking power, we have way bigger impact than if we do this at a parochial scale.
Yeah, I love hearing about that cross collaboration, how cities can learn from each other. So you're not just operating on this island. But what I'm also hearing is that these roles have become far more expansive than they were a decade or even a few years ago. We are going to get into what's in the Inflation Reduction Act, but I do wonder how. Basically, are you seeing the resources? Do you feel supported in this more expansive endeavor to tackle climate impacts, but also pilot these solutions?
Would that be Susie or me or all of us?
Yeah, I mean, this is relevant to all of you, so please jump in.
Okay, I just wanted to jump in and say, a couple of things. The first one, it is totally intimidating to be in a panel with Julia and Susie and Rebecca, because you know what you're talking about. You are really eloquent, and I'm also very jealous of your background, Susie. I can only imagine that is Boulder County, and and here I am in a pretend library, and you, like, for people who joined late, you didn't hear Julia sing before, so I'm also jealous that she can do that. No, and I couldn't agree more. I really think that, like at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, people thought that, the world is for the nerds to take on. And I think now the climate nerds are taking over. Like, really, a lot of us who've been working in this space for a really long time are finally finding, the right moment to act and to implement new ideas. And at the same time, we're moving away from these red light policies. For a very long time, we started looking at the environmental movement as a way of banning people from doing things. And there was not enough room for people like us to really propose policy, policy that would advance this. And I really think that for the past decade, we have seen that transformation. And right now, we're seeing cities, taking leadership roles. And to no one's surprise, really, because if you think about what happened in Paris, how we came with huge ambition and, we want to change the world and we're going to sing Kumbaya together and all that kind of crap. The reality is that, from ambition to pledge to negotiation with the president to Congress, by the moment it hits the cities, it's like, do what you can. And it's discouraging, really. So it is really for us to take over and like, okay, if you don't want to do it, we'll do it. And then suddenly the federal government is catching on and they're like, okay, we'll help you out. And then some states are saying like, okay, we'll help you out. So finally, we're doing this. And about working together, Rebecca, I think, one of the coolest things, and I think Julia is in part to blame, we sustainability directors, we get together and drink every Friday, right? And we used to do that mostly to commiserate, but today, we do that to exchange ideas and to think about how we can work together and make things happen. This idea of a national level bulk purchasing program for heat pumps, for example, or the national accelerator, like the national green bank idea, all of those things are coming up because we are demanding those. So I'm going to stop here because I could talk for hours, but I just want to say it's cool to be here.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall of these weekly hangouts, to be honest. Sounds great. Yeah, I do want to get into the specific ways that your respective communities are models here. I guess turning back over to Louise, I hope to hear from you. Ithaca, as I understand it, became the first city to commit to 100% decarbonization, which is a really big deal because what we're seeing throughout the country are cities saying they're going to make new construction electric. But what I think Ithaca is doing here is they're saying we're doing it all. We're going above and beyond just new construction and saying we are tackling actually the hardest parts of the climate problem, which is existing infrastructure and how that's tethered to things like gas and oil. So yeah, I want to hear how that's going. Basically, this is a fairly new policy, what those steps have looked like, and especially tying in this social justice lens of how do you do this in a just and equitable manner?
Well, I think honestly, we've been talking about, environmental justice, and then we're talking about social justice. Finally, we can talk about climate justice and how, it all intersects, how it all touches. And what we tried to do in Ithaca was to, in 2019, the city council passed this resolution that was, let's go and fight climate change. Let's put everything that we have and let's, finally, make a stand. And at the same time that we're doing that, let's see if we can also address historical inequities, economic inequality, social injustice. And this is before 2020, right? So 2020 comes, and this thing that was like a second line in the resolution, it became core, front and center of everything that we have to do. And if you think about it, we didn't need 2020 to happen for us to realize that social justice has to be there. I have made very public that there was a time in my life, when I was about to receive an award from the US president on the work that we have been doing on climate change. It was the same day when I was arrested for lingering while brown in Washington. So, like I remember, like in 12 hours, I got this huge lesson on, race relations in America and how disconnected it was from the fight that we had against climate change. So when I was able to take on this job, I was very grateful because I was able to help design a policy that will take a whole city to be carbon neutral by 2030, which is very aggressive, and we can get into the details. But in doing so, we're gonna do it, making sure that justice, that sustainable prosperity was something that was to be shared by everybody in the community. So what the city of Ithaca decided to do was to first, address, new construction and major renovations, and then ban natural gas, starting 2026. Then, I always love saying this because it was before New York City, but of course we're a small city, so, nobody paid attention to us. But then we came on with like, oh, you know what, we're going to take on existing buildings. And the truth is, for us, and I think for the entire country, about 40% of the emissions came from existing buildings, the way we use energy in our buildings. So we needed to address that. Otherwise, we're just playing, right? So we figured out a way of doing that. There wasn't enough money, so figure out a way of taking advantage of private capital to bring it in. And now we are well on our way. We are at the very beginning of the process. We're learning. It's painful, I need to be honest. We get a ton of help. We talk to people like Susie, for example, every so often, and we get ideas, we get advice, and we fix what is wrong, and we continue moving forward. So right now, the challenge is 6,000 buildings in the next 7 years. It's going to be difficult. It's 10,000 vehicles in the next 7 years. It's going to be hard. We need to improve the infrastructure. We need to do workforce development, but at the core of everything, we need to make sure that climate justice is at the core of every single policy. So there is an equity justification for every single action that we take.
What was that you mentioned private capital was a big source of funding. What has that looked like of trying to I guess patch or come up with funding for this public policy? Is that enough, or I assume you're also expecting some funding if this bill actually passes Congress?
Well, I mean, just think about it. This is the city of Ithaca, 30,000 people, 10,000 square feet surrounded by reality, as they say. And, what you have is a budget that is about $80 million a year. So then, you do the numbers, you do the math about how much this transformation is going to cost. And we're talking about $2 billion. That was the number that we came up with our climate action plan, right? So if we were to achieve full carbon neutrality, that means transformation of the entire economy. So this is super expensive. There is no money in the state. There is no money in the federal government that should pay for this. And the reality is that, multiply that by whatever you want. According to Princeton, it's about $4 trillion. According to Stanford, it's like 5 trillion. I mean, it's a huge amount of money. So when you start looking at that, then you need to rely on the money that is out there. And private capital comes in very handy. So then you need to rethink the whole strategy. You need to think about federal money, state money that can come in to buy down the cost of capital. It's not necessarily the risking, but it's buying down the cost of capital. And then you need to think about, a comprehensive approach that you can de-risk in aggregation. So if you think about it that way, then emissions that are a problem for me become a market opportunity for those who invest in energy efficiency. So what we did was to say, the city is open for business. There's a huge opportunity. There is 400,000 metric tons of opportunity for people that want to come in and help us get rid of that. And then suddenly the money started flowing. We started coming up with new type of contracts, new type of agreements, and then suddenly we were, playing with, like, right now we have secured $105 million from private investors, and we have sub commitments that takes all the way to $500 million. And yeah, the LPO office will play a role, the federal government will play a role, but I think this is the role of private capital, I think.
Julia, I'm just curious if you have anything to add on electrification initiatives you're seeing throughout the country. This is something that has really caught fire. That's a terrible metaphor, but we've seen this explode just in, I think, since 2020 or 2019. So would love to hear a bit more of the national context.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, like Luis said, existing buildings are a huge challenge, right? There's tons of them, it's a huge source of emissions, and trying to figure out how to tackle that from a project management point of view and a resource point of view and an equity point of view is a very big multi-layered challenge. And so folks are figuring out a lot of different ways to tackle that. We've got some policy in Washington and in Seattle and King County where folks are tackling that. Same thing in Colorado. So there's a lot happening nationally. I think what is difficult is figuring out getting access to the resources to do that. And that's part of what I think is exciting about the National Green Bank that is in the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So this, like Luis was saying, could be a way to leverage a lot more capital to do these retrofits and make these transformations. A relatively small amount of money can actually unlock a ton of potential, and I know that's what they're projecting out in the numbers that I saw. And supposedly a huge piece of that is supposed to be allocated towards, I think, the disadvantaged and environmental justice communities. I don't know if they haven't totally finalized what that means yet. But it's supposed to go to those communities, which is super important. And that'll help with, innovative financing. It'll also help get a lot of projects off the ground that wouldn't be funded by private capital or that maybe wouldn't qualify for federal grants. There are a lot of barriers for under-resourced communities and marginalized communities to actually get those federal funds. So I'm really hoping that the Green Bank becomes a way for those communities to get that access to make those changes. But the other thing that, at the same time that Luis and Ithaca are off to the races, there are lots of other folks who are really struggling because of state preemption laws. And I don't know if this is a place we want to go, but I would just note that state preemption also can be a real challenge. So for some of our folks in several states across the country, the state legislatures have passed bills that say essentially that cities can't, say, ban gas, or they can't mandate more efficient building codes. There's a whole host of resources that cities actually have available to them to make changes to building codes. It's one of the areas cities have the most power. So it's one of the places where when we talk about cities making emissions cuts, we're really talking about buildings in a lot of cases. And then sometimes state legislatures will go in and say, actually, you're not going to do that. We're not going to let you do that. And some really cut deep on that. And then these cities' hands are tied. So they really want to be more ambitious. And they maybe even would be able to leverage the funding to be more ambitious, but they can't. And so we're seeing pockets of the country able to really race forward on this. And then we're seeing other pockets of the country with their hands tied. So it's definitely a battle, and it is the direction we have to go. We have to go to building electrification. We have to go to retrofits. A bunch of colleagues of mine actually put together a really great guide to equitable electrification for affordable housing and multifamily. And so that's a really great resource for folks who are able to do it. But we've got whole swaths of the country who aren't able to, and it's, not only is it hurting the emissions goals, but it's hurting the folks living there, because ultimately these are going to be cheaper buildings to rent. They're going to be cheaper houses to own. And they're going to be safer, and they're going to be more comfortable. So these folks are being deprived of better places to live because of this, which is a real shame. I don't know if that's the direction you wanted me to go, but that's what's on my mind right now for the folks that I'm working with.
Yeah, when you said preemption, that's just like a light bulb went off, because I did a story last year about this march of preemption laws. I think it's really interesting because it's this industry kind of, or the backlash to all this progress happening at the city level, that we're now seeing the backlash to that. And I think this might be out of date. My last count, it was like 20 states have passed preemption laws. That might be growing. They're still pushing this. But Susie, I hope I'm not wrong on this. I don't think Colorado is one of those states because of its politics that has preemption, but you did mention electrification and looking at utilities in Boulder County. And one thing I keep coming back to is that places are dealing with the impacts of climate change at the same time they are trying to clean up pollution. So I wanted to hear a bit about the role the Marshall Fire has played, I guess, and if that event, that horrific wildfire, has changed any of Boulder County's planning or thinking around its climate initiatives.
Yeah, that's thank you. That's such a great question, and it's such a great discussion, and it's really relative to, Luis is talking about the funding and how expensive it is to decarbonize the built environment. We're talking about resources today. And what's really important to talk about is the cost and risk of doing nothing in terms of the expense of the climate crisis, right, on communities. So as you just mentioned, Rebecca, we recently experienced an unprecedented firestorm. It's not even a wildfire. It was a urban wild firestorm at the end of December, put out by snow the next day. It was the most destructive wildfire in Colorado history, destroying 1,100 homes and leaving so many displaced. It is now known as the 10th most expensive fire in the U.S. history, and it might be the 9th now. So we're not alone. Many communities have experienced climate-related catastrophes, and it's just extraordinarily draining for a community to go through something like this. And all of the social, emotional, and economic costs that follow are sort of lingering long after the news media has stopped and that the fire is put out or the climate-related disaster has kind of moved on. It's really fascinating. I was actually looking at, since I moved to Colorado in 2001, Boulder County has experienced 6 major wildfire events and 1 500-year flood event. And many of those my own children have witnessed. And so it's really important for me to emphasize these are not just one-off events. They fit into a pattern of extreme events due to changing climatic conditions. And I am so concerned this is becoming our new normal. And I think given these disasters are becoming more frequent in our community, our team and other teams across all municipalities are in a tough spot. We have to be the first responders to the climate crisis in our communities. And our team is still trying to be as proactive as possible, like mitigating this massive climate crisis. And so my point is that local governments really are facing the increased burden of resourcing the preparation for, the response to, the recovery from climate change impacts. And it's incredible how one singular event that we definitely could not have prepared for, like not on the models for what we were thinking about for climate risk at all, put us in a reactive mode, right, instead of being proactive. So in terms of how we're shaping and thinking about how to become more proactive in our adaptation approach, we're trying to help community members understand the climate-related risk in their own neighborhoods and the threats that they face, and really trying to match that knowledge by mapping it in per neighborhood, and then giving them those resources to become more resilient and adapt to those types of climate vulnerabilities. So whether that's flood, fire, high heat, drought, we're trying to, again, match resources to where communities are going to be facing those high risks. And I think it's really important to note that we are not alone. Boulder County is just one little local government that has experienced this, right? I just was reading from Yale that, I think it's almost half of US adults have experienced the effects of climate change. Again, whether high heat, extreme weather, or wildfire. And then 1 in 3 Americans last summer experienced a very extreme climate-related weather event. And I'm sure that number is now 1 in 2, given what we're seeing across the US. So the point is we're all in this together. And I think that's where we can share those best practices on how to move forward in telling the story of risk. But it is overwhelming because, again, as I talked about the role shifting and changing over time, this is one area of like to have in my title that I never imagined having. I thought by the time I was here now, right, that we would have done all the things that were set out to do for emissions reductions and frankly now carbon removal, but we did not. We were putting ourselves in more risk by not doing anything. And I think I'm very happy to see federal legislation pass. And you know, it's late to do this because we're now going to be recovering from these events, and it takes a lot of resources to do that well.
And I think if I may just add, I think it goes to what you were asking about, local government, these place-based knowledge and networks that enhance preparedness and accelerate recovery post climate events. I think this is really important. It's where the rubber hits the road, really. And so we need to be, local governments. We need to be empowered to develop and implement adaptation and hazard mitigation plans. And I really think that what Susie just talked about is a clear example of why we are a bit late to the fight, but not entirely, but we need to accelerate what we're doing.
Yeah, you just laid out some of the devastating impacts, kind of the problems here. And it's interesting that number that 1 in 3 Americans experience climate impacts, because this summer I came across it. It was about 1 in 3 Americans who were under these heat wave warnings the last few weeks. So this is obviously still a very active problem. I'd love to get into now what's actually in the Inflation Reduction Act. I guess we're kind of operating a bit under the assumption that this may actually pass. If we had this conversation a little over a week ago, we would have been talking about something very different, about congressional inaction. But Luis, I saw you tweet something along the lines of how this money enables us to do the work, but it's really going to be up to local action to implement this and I'm paraphrasing here, but carry this through. And we've already touched on the National Green Bank a bit in our discussion, but can you just explain, first of all, what a green bank is, and what this actually means and translates into how this helps clean energy growth?
Yeah, I think you need to look at the example of how, first, for those who are not necessarily familiar with the bill, there is about $27 billion that are going towards the creation of, they're not calling it that in the bill, but, it's the creation of a national green bank. And if you look at, what has happened with green banks at the state and local level, you have the examples of the Connecticut Green Bank, which is like the green bank model that everyone wants to follow. And how they have, this mission of, removing this reliance on subsidies and incentives and do aggregation of otherwise high risk, small scale projects, and then taking on different asset class. So basically what they are doing is helping local and national financial institutions, by de-risking participation in the clean energy transformation. So a green bank actually takes on that role. It's not necessarily, it should be seen as a financial authority rather than a bank. And if we have this at the national level, we have an entity that could help the risk, investment in these climate-friendly assets. That in some states, for example, they don't have a green bank, like in the case of Connecticut, of New York, and New York is a fascinating example because it might be the largest in terms of mandate and scope, but at the same time, because of the coexistence of agencies like NYSERDA, it makes it very, very interesting. How you can combine these strategies to the risk investment in these assets with other programs that will enable climate justice and equity, when you are, driving an entire transformation. So I've been tweeting about it because I'm very excited about the opportunity to work with a national level green bank. And there are examples of what happened at the local level, like the Montgomery Green Bank, for example, in Maryland. I believe that, what they did or what they're trying to do is to really accelerate this transformation when they don't get the help that they need at the state level. So it could be at the county level, at the state level, at the national level. And honestly, we're fighting in Ithaca trying to figure out a way of developing like the regional Ithaca Green Bank that could help us accelerate some of the participation that we need from the local CDFIs and credit unions.
I'd love to hear from each of you what you're maybe most excited about in the Inflation Reduction Act, in terms of like what you think could be a game changer at the local level. I guess, Susie, would you like to start?
Sure. Excuse me. I think I'm really excited. I think this was mentioned before, but about the environmental justice and community resilience components of this act. And I think that's built in climate pollution reduction grants, I believe, which is a mouthful, or climate justice block grants. And I think this is so important and game changing. I think including and supporting our communities of color and underserved communities who obviously will bear the disproportionate burden of climate impacts and climate chaos deserve these resources, decision-making power on the solutions to these issues. They have so many ingenious ideas of how to implement these on a local level in community. And that's the point, right? And they've been left out of both the climate movement and decision-making. So it's just, I think this is going to be an opportunity to accelerate a lot of change in that area. So I'm looking forward to that.
And Julie, is there something, there's a lot here, obviously we won't get through every provision, but what would you highlight?
Yeah, that's a tough question. So I echo Susie on the block grants for community projects that are going to really allow, supposedly, I think, allow communities to like access those funds directly, set their own priorities for their own projects to do what they need to do. I think that's going to be great. There's a lot of there are a lot of other provisions that are going to either go directly to disadvantaged and frontline communities, either wholly or in part. So I know there's going to be, I'm excited about all the, I think it's 1 billion or something for grants and loans for energy efficiency and resilience for affordable housing. Affordable housing really needs all the money that we can give it, plus more housing. So I'm excited about that. There's a lot going to urban forestry, which is interesting. And a lot of that is also going to be prioritizing communities that are suffering a lot from heat and pollution. So I'm excited about that. I mean, decarbonizing heavy duty vehicles, schools, buses, trucks. I mean, I'd love to see these pollution corridors disappearing. Love to see, ports, there's 3 billion to reduce pollution at ports. That's great. I'm very excited. There's a ton in here that I think could be great. Also, there's a ton of money that's going to go to low and middle income individuals, right, around heat pumps and home energy retrofits. And so I know a lot of the programs that local governments have tried to do to help with decarbonizing and improving housing stock for low and middle income homeowners are now going to get a real boost, because you can't ask people to do that and then say, but also we don't have any money to help you. And now there's actually going to be money and resources and programs. Hopefully, I think they're shooting for like 1 million homes or more or something like that. So I think that's great. I'm excited about that too. I don't want to be a doubter, but I also feel like I just have to say, like, I'm really excited about all these things. And I'm also like, we've still got giveaways in here. We're still throwing some communities under the bus in here. Not okay with it. And this is where we are, because this is where we live and this is what's happening. But there's tension. There's tension in this moment. And we have to live with that and keep moving forward and keep doing the best we can. But that's alive here right now too. Luis, inject some more excitement into this. What are you excited about?
Well, one, I think I will vote for you the moment you decide to run. So please think about it. I think, you have a ton of fans out there and you have the right idea. So anyway, just putting it out there. But truth be told, I am very excited about this thing, mostly because it's clever. It's like really, really clever. For a really long time, we Democrats, liberals, we think we're super smart and we never come up with anything this clever. I mean, this is really groundbreaking also from the policy making point of view. I mean, the way of, turning this into an opportunity to reduce inflation, it's just it's just brilliant. It is truly amazing. And there is one bit lost in there. Like President invoked the Defense Production Act several weeks ago, and there was no money for it. And we were excited about it, but there was no money. So finally, we find in there like there is $500 million that are going to go to open, support the development of heat pump manufacturing facilities. So that means jobs at the same time. And the other thing that I find, awesome is the fact that right now we are, we're finally finding a way of getting everybody to the table, and I agree with you. I would have loved it if we didn't have to give up all of these concessions, but we brought people to the table, and now we need to worry about cinema and Sanders and a bunch of others that will object to things here and there. But man, I'm excited. I think this thing could pass, and the world's gonna look so different after that.
Can I just add
and I'm
on
also.
to that?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Susie.
This is so
No,
exciting,
you do it.
right?
You go.
We all want to jump in. Well, thanks, Louise. I really think you're right that what I love about the frame of this, I see, I'm an optimist and a realist, and I see climate crisis as something, awful, and I see it as one of the greatest opportunities in human history for wealth creation, for the future we want to see, for better health outcomes, for all of these things. And I do think you're right that it is clever to talk about and to see and to frame this as a great economic opportunity, and for us to be the leaders of this future we want to see. So I think it's a humongous missed opportunity if this does not pass for us, for international leadership, right? We've been an international disgrace, let's be clear, not only in the entire global community, but clearly for the children growing up on this planet, and the sort of generational justice issues that the US, given our cumulative impact on greenhouse gas emissions, has been the highest than any other country, period. We don't need to talk about today. We need to talk about the accumulation of those CO2 molecules in the air, and that's from the US. So we need to show leadership. And so I get really jazzed about the fact that we can look at this in an optimistic way and say this is going to both get us out of this inflation mess and create opportunity.
And I think one key. Sorry, just one last comment, Rebecca. I apologize, but
Go for it. I love it.
Biden came in and he inspired everybody. We're gonna do climate, guys, and we're gonna be working on this and climate justice and all of this stuff. And I'm so sick and tired of being inspired. We needed opportunity. We needed something. Finally, somebody had to look at. We had a pandemic, the economic shock of the pandemic. We have the climate crisis. How do we address both of them? And it's no longer inspiration. It's actual opportunity that is in front of us. So if Congress acts on this, they will enable opportunity, and the difference is huge, because people don't pay rent with inspiration. People don't put food on the table with inspiration. So doing this finally in a way that makes sense economically is just wonderful. I'm truly excited about this thing, man.
Yeah, and I think it's what, 60 billion or something to help build clean energy industries in the US, and I think all of those tax incentives are tied to prevailing wage jobs and union jobs, and so I'm excited about that piece too. And so far, it seems like a lot of the announcements, at least historically, around this have been, investments in the Great Lakes, in the Southeast. I know Rivian's opening in Georgia. We need to be making that stuff here. We need some really great jobs doing that work, and that's only going to expand. And so that's really exciting too, because I feel like we've talked a lot about green jobs and the potential, but we haven't even scratched the surface on what's available there to folks. So I think that will start playing out here, which is really exciting too, especially in those areas of the country. Okay, Rebecca, over to you. Next question. Take us where you want to go.
Well, yeah, I wanted to thank also the attendees who've submitted some questions so far and comments. We will get to them. I'm keeping track of them. So thank you. Please keep using the Q&A and chat. Actually, our last point here ties in very much into a question I had. So if this doesn't pass, or kind of putting yourself back in that mindset just over a week ago of where we didn't think legislation was possible at all, this is a pretty crude framing, but does that mean we're screwed? to put that a little more specifically, I am curious kind of the limits of local action, what that runs up against, what you're running up against. And Julia, you're mentioning parts of the country where we don't see a lot of climate action. Like I'm thinking red states or blue islands in red states where they are not seeing that support from their state legislators or funding. So yeah, I'd kind of love to play devil's advocate here of what kind of limits we actually see, and are we running up against that at the local level? I'll just throw that to Julia first, and folks can jump in.
Sure. Yeah, so couple things, lots of things I could say, but I'll touch briefly on a few. So one is preemption, like we talked about. That's been a huge problem. We talked specifically about building electrification, but that's been a problem with a lot of different energy buildings and other policies. Basically, if locals can enact certain policies, codes, etc., sometimes those are then preempted at the state level. That becomes a problem. There's also just, apart from the political piece, there are a lot of cities and towns across the country that have been, under-resourced, that are marginalized, that have been shut out of the process. And, there's a lot of money being made available even before this, right? We've got some of the money from the IIJA that's flowing, and we have J40. And so we've got, all these resources that are supposed to be allocated to underserved communities, and there's a tool to figure that out, and they're going to finalize the tool, and there's all this stuff that's supposed to be available, but there's still a lot of hurdles even with those improvements. So, what we hear from folks a lot is that a lot of local governments just don't have the capacity to identify, seek out, and apply for these grants. They don't have the staff capacity to implement and handle all the money. They don't have the capacity to administer the grant, right? It's like, I'm not going to apply for a grant if I can't even administer it. So a lot of the places that really need this funding and need these resources aren't actually able to access them. Or there are requirements like outdated cost benefit analyses that actually end up privileging property over people. And so if you don't have fancy property to protect, it's more difficult to get the funding to do what you need to do. And so there's a lot of these sort of large and small structural barriers that can keep folks from accessing some of the resources they need to do this work, in addition to then some of the political dynamics, which, it's funny because like clean energy is overwhelmingly popular everywhere. The GMU Yale data shows that. A lot of these programs are overwhelmingly popular everywhere. And so there's people want them, but because of a variety of these kinds of issues, they can be held back from it. And so I think local governments can do a lot. And we have in recent years also pushed against some of the limits of that, which when Susie was talking about working together in coalitions, either multi-city, regionally, in a state, cross-state, utility area. There are all these combinations of partnerships and working together where cities can make a much bigger aggregate impact than they can on their own, to work beyond the levels of their jurisdictions.
Oh, Susie, did you want to add something there?
I will add that despite the fact I'm a huge fan of what municipalities are doing and local governments, obviously big fan of the work, the scale of this issue is way too huge without federal action and without federal resources. Given this year and last, we put more carbon into our atmosphere, more than any other previous year. And it makes us less likely to achieve that 1.5 degree C limit, right? And so we have a 50% chance of achieving that goal. And that's if we stop emissions today. And so we know that's not happening. And we need to accelerate it as fast as possible. And I think it's interesting because like we're just talking about emissions reductions. We're not even talking about the entire carbon dioxide removal market, which will help us deal with the legacy emissions that are lodged in our atmosphere for hundreds and hundreds of years, lifetimes, right? We need to deal with those at a gigaton scale, removing those because our atmosphere is already saturated. So I just feel like I need to wrap a bow on this one because federal legislation is absolutely essential at helping us, mitigate this climate crisis. It just cannot happen at the local level like we want it to, without those types of resources and without those market signals and without national leadership, frankly. So I just had to say it.
And sorry, I just jumped in, but honestly, I agree with you. I believe that, it's not one or the other. We need to continue working together as much as we can make progress. And there are different limitations at every level. And so it's very difficult to say that, without the support of the cities and the states, the federal government is going to make a difference. But then at the same time, local, there are limitations in terms of what you can do. But what has become really obvious is that, we are doing this. It's how fast we can actually get there. One of the things that became very obvious to me is now that we have seen what is, the power of sharing a common goal, the power of visualizing the end game. Like Kennedy did it at some point when he said, we're going to land on the moon. Nobody had any clue how to make that happen, but the transformation that followed. And same thing happened, with the vaccine. We need a vaccine and we need it fast. And then suddenly everybody worked on something that was impossible and we made it happen. So here we're not talking about 6 months. We're not talking about 9 years. We're talking about probably longer time frame. But, this is in movement already. We already started moving in the right direction. Federal leadership, state leadership, local leadership, all together can accelerate this. And that is the key, right? So we're not lost, but, we can do this much faster, I think.
Well
yeah,
said.
and we're not talking about businesses at all, but that's a problem. So there's we can do a lot of work at the local level, and a lot of other people are putting a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. It's not all cities, right? It's businesses, it's the fossil fuel industry. Boulder cannot single-handedly take them down. That's not how this works, right? And so yeah, absolutely, there are limits. There's a ton we can do, and people are doing it, and everyone's got to be pushing this boulder up the hill. We all have to be doing it in order to get where we need to go. And cities are not going to save us by ourselves. We're just not. So, but we can do a lot, right?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I think Biden, made a joke about this, but the truth is, why are we thinking about Mars? Why don't we really get together, businesses and cities and government and think about a way of saving our planet? Mars, yeah, well, that sounds cool, dude. But honestly, businesses, companies like Tesla, that have a lot of influence, could exercise that influence in a better way, adding equity to the innovation. And then the very large organizations have so much influence. And I saw, I don't mean to make a commercial, but, honestly, I saw Google putting all of these tools available for free for municipalities. I mean, that is the kind of partnership that we need to have. And it has to go beyond that. But, this is a good start, but we need more. We need more partnerships, really.
I love that you brought up Mars. We are gifted. We've been gifted an incredible place to be. This planet is unbelievable. Let's do our best. There's no need for Mars talk.
I know. It's the land of all the national parks and Tom Brady and all these wonderful things that happen to this country. So yeah, I'm just kidding. I don't like the Patriots or the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but I have to say it.
You've heard it here, position against Mars. So we're talking a lot about funding and Congress putting money where its mouth is, but I would love to explore just another side of local action I've been fascinated with, and that's litigation. I know Boulder is one of the many places we're seeing that is taking oil companies to court over climate damages. And this seems like a bit of the long play because a lot of these court cases are still very active. We're not sure where they will lead yet, but it's hugely fascinating because it could mean it could make a big impact in the end. So Susie, I'd love to hear from you a bit about these climate damages cases.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I sort of love talking about this. So because it's, again, the systems change, right? So Boulder County, along with San Miguel County on the Western Slope, great community, and the city of Boulder, one of our amazing partners, we filed a lawsuit in 2018 and against Exxon and Suncor, some of the dirtiest fossil fuel companies out there. And the whole idea behind this lawsuit really is for them to pay their fair share of the mess that they helped create, right? So in a nutshell, this is about the fact that communities, as I've already mentioned, have huge price tags related to climate impacts. In fact, we just did an analysis, and now it's kind of outdated. It was 2017, I believe. We are up in hundreds of millions in just damages to roads from high heat, roads and other infrastructure because of high heat when roads buckle. So the fossil fuel industry basically, and you know this more than anyone because you've been reporting on this, Rebecca, but they've known about the dangers for 50 years of these products that they've been selling, and they've misled the public, right? Instead of acting responsibly, they chose to conceal this information and deceive the public so they could continue to profit. And so these companies really should be responsible to pay their fair share of all those costs associated with climate change impacts, so the costs do not fall disproportionately on taxpayers. Because as mentioned, our communities have a huge price tag and steep costs of climate action. I already told you about the Marshall Fire. So we should not be, left alone with the price tag of that climate change when these fossil fuel companies continue to make a profit and continue to spread that disinformation on climate change and actively block climate policy. So I like to look at these lawsuits as very similar to those filed against big tobacco and opioid manufacturers, which also deceive the public in the pursuit of their profits. In terms of our legal status right now, the case is proceeding through the courts. Exxon and Suncor are doing their absolute best to delay the case from moving forward, which is a long, like you said, a long play. And the case is currently on hold in the US Supreme Court as it responds to Exxon's petition to hear the case. But honestly, we're really hopeful. I think these lawsuits are a really good example of the kind of action that local governments can take to respond to the climate crisis. We need to use every single option at our disposal, whether that's, courts, legislation, local action, community building, capacity building. And so this is just one of sort of the more systems level change. I will say it's really exciting because Boulder County and this lawsuit was the first in the interior of the US aimed at holding fossil fuel companies accountable. It spawned a lot of other lawsuits. Now there are 27 lawsuits that local governments are in. And there's also one non-governmental organization, it's a fishermen's association, doing the same thing in terms of suing the fossil fuel industry for future damages. And so another systems change we're after on corporate responsibility and corporate accountability related to climate impacts. And if we win, it would be a huge precedence, like in holding industry accountable to climate change damage. And it will make it easier for other communities to sue for those types of monies moving forward.
Yeah, and this isn't even just happening in the US. It's incredible to see these cases are taking off around the world. So certainly it's on oil and gas's radar, though I kind of flinched when you said it's at the Supreme Court, because it's almost like you want to time that so it might not be under one of the most or the most conservative Supreme Court we've seen. But I'd love to shift a bit to some of the comments we're getting in the chat, and just a reminder to use the Q&A feature for submitting questions so they don't get lost in the chat. But one more of a comment from Michael Schenk here was noting that the role of climate justice director is also taking off in communities, and he pointed to Seattle as one example. But I'm just curious, have you seen that? Do you think there's a rise of climate justice directors, and how might that work with sustainability officers?
I have not heard about that, to be honest. I've been following obviously very closely, everything that has to do with climate justice and the work that Shalanda Baker is doing at the federal level, and but I had not seen these climate justice directors. I mean, I just learned in the chat that there are a few already, and I think it is great. We have a person in Ithaca that is whose sole focus is climate justice. She's a sustainability planner, but her heart, her brain, it is all focused on the right things. And I think this is necessary. This is absolutely necessary. There is no way we can do this without taking all of these communities with us. And and it has to go beyond ethnicity or race, right? I mean, we're talking about undocumented tribal nations, indigenous people. We're talking about formerly incarcerated. So climate justice takes a complete different meaning now when we're talking about all of these affinity groups and actual, groups that have been, properly identified. So I think it is a wonderful thing, and it should happen everywhere.
I agree with you 100%. And we often bring in the Seattle's Environmental Justice Director to our class to talk about her role. So I'm very familiar with that role. And we just hired our first climate equity strategist for Boulder County. And she is extremely inspirational in her approach. And she has 30 years of deep community engagement and climate justice activism experience. So I feel like she's only going to catapult and propel the amazing work that needs to get done within those communities and bringing those voices forward in solutions. She's got such an interesting idea right now that is new, so just bear with it, but it's really about how do we help those types of communities be a part of the systems change that I was just sharing with you, and how do we build a lot like lobbying power among communities that have often been left out of the decision-making arena. And so there's a lot of talk about creating sort of a climate justice lobbying organization. And that would be very impactful because we already have pretty strong community-oriented climate lobbying going on with Communities for Climate Action, which Boulder County initiated with a lot of other supporters. But there is still this need, I think, for those voices to be heard at the state legislature in policy, in the implementation and regulation components of that policy. And there's a lot of brilliant ideas coming from those types of communities. So I'm really excited to see what comes out of that.
There was also some discussion in the chat about donut economics and a circular economy. I I read Kate Raworth's book on this like years ago, so I hope I'm not butchering this explanation, but the idea of like capitalism just failing our society, obviously climate change, and thinking about how we shift towards more renewal, reuse. Julie, I saw you jumped in on chat, so I hope you could take this off and hopefully do a better job explaining what donut economics actually means. I'm curious how or if you're seeing this play a role in city and local planning.
Great question. I mean, I'm not a donut economics expert, to be clear, but I mean, in a nutshell, it really is about like how do we live within the our planetary boundaries. I think boundaries or limits are the terms that she uses, as well as providing for all of the essential needs of people and other species, right? So we have this donut, we have this kind of these ecological limits, and then we have these floors for human and other species thriving, right? So we want to be here. And what happens is that we've got a lot of people living down here, and we've got a lot of resource use up here. And so we're not in this sweet spot, right? Which is where we want to be. And you know, I can't say that I know of any USDN members currently who have like officially adopted donut economics as their model. I would love that. But I think we are thinking a lot about that, you know, as sustainability offices, and thinking about what does it mean to really think about regeneration? What does it mean to, what does it look like to think about creating communities where we are minimizing our waste, we're using only what we need, and you know, there are a lot of folks who are actually really looking to push the limits of what this looks like traditionally, with thinking about regenerative models, looking to biomimicry, right? What can we actually learn from nature about how we should be living? There's, you know, 3 billion years of wisdom already on this planet. What can we learn about how we can be living in a way that is balanced, where we can all thrive, we can all have everything that we need and grow, but grow in a way that is in cooperation and collaboration with this living system. And so we're looking at that, like, what does that mean? What does that look like from like local government, right? Like, how does that actually play out? And what are the kinds of relationships and partnerships and policies we can pursue that start shifting us more to that mindset over time? And I think that is a long game. I mean, it's not something that a lot of folks are going to be able to like wake up tomorrow and you know, like I said, adopt the donut economics resolution at city council. But I think we're shifting. We are shifting towards that model. Is not just local governments, but really communities and community groups and folks are asking for this, right? They're banging on the doors. They're asking for this work. They're asking for these changes. And I think the continuing extreme weather experiences that folks are having are also, I think, they are accelerating that need and that desire for that kind of action. So that was kind of maybe part of an answer. Others, feel free to chime in.
Thank you for that. I can't define this, so I'm making you do it. Yeah, that's fascinating that this is increasingly integrated in an approach, even if it's not an official, like this is what we're doing. So we have another question. I think we've been talking about the pieces of climate justice and environmental justice. One comment is how Vermont just passed an environmental justice law that does need funding to actually deliver. That would hopefully come from the Inflation Reduction Act, and would yeah, love to hear. Maybe this is good to start with for Louise of the environmental justice provisions in the bill. How big of a deal this will be for actually implementing these priorities.
I want to start with the donut economics, just a quick comment on that, and then I'll come back to this one, if you don't mind. So the donut economics is you know, it's interesting, and it's very difficult to operationalize. You know, it is, you know, it has a very interesting series of concepts. I think what happened recently was that Mariana Mazzucato actually, you know, took that and put it on steroids, and then, you know, drove towards a complete new idea, a new model, you know, with mission economy and the value of everything, and, you know, all of those books and theories. And just recently was at the World Economic Forum, you know, a couple of months ago, where she was talking about, you know, how to operationalize mission economy. And I think that is, you know, like the level of you know, understanding of the new type of economic policy that is needed to be merged with climate policy. And it touches on environmental justice and climate justice, you know, so it's finally this concept that has become finally comprehensive enough, but also not easy, but, you know, operationalizable. Well, we can operationalize, you know, incorporate. And I need to say the model that we're implementing, the Ithaca Green New Deal's economic model, is entirely based on mission economy. So we did take a close look at, you know, at all of these different theories related to sustainability and economics, even behavioral economics, and we came up with a model that we hope can work. You know, the provisions for environmental justice and climate justice in the bill are, you know, are important. They were overdue, and, you know, there was this, you know, from Justice 40 from the very beginning, since Biden, you know, was campaigning and eventually came into office, and then the creation of, you know, this position for, once again, for Shalonda Baker to run with climate justice at the federal level. I think they all needed a way of, you know, matching the efforts that were happening at the local level in different places. You know, Vermont, the city of Ithaca, Seattle, you know, Ann Arbor, they are all, you know, we're all looking at these. We're all in some cases, there is a need for a more specific definition of what climate justice means at the local level, because, you know, because of the level of granularity that we have at the federal and even at the state level. But once you have that, then you start thinking about how do you operationalize a climate, an environmental justice or a climate justice program that will actually benefit and drive, you know, sustainable prosperity for the community. And I think that was the gap that the bill is coming to fill. You know, finally we have a way of, you know, matching our local efforts to what the federal government is trying to achieve, and there is a line of funding. But I really think that, you know, the intention itself, you know, it is important. You know, it more than the money. You know, there's a ton of money and it's going to be great, but I think it's signaling intention, and finally is you know, aligning a lot of what we're trying to do at the local level with what the federal government has been proposing for several years, but without any clear idea on how to operationalize. So I hope that made sense.
And yeah, I realize we're talking a lot about funding, which probably is the biggest thing here, and the intention that, like you talked about, but I realize we haven't talked a ton about regulation and executive action, which has up until a few days ago seemed to be the only option left for the Biden administration. And I'm curious if there's anything that does impact at, or would be very important at the local level that you're watching on the regulatory front. If to make things more complicated, there was also mention in the chat of climate emergency declarations. And I wonder if that would make a big difference in actually implementing these policies, some kind of declaration. I guess, yeah, Susie, we haven't heard from you
Sure.
in a minute, but I'm curious, maybe kick us off with if there are executive actions that you're closely watching that can make a big difference.
I mean, absolutely. Like, yes, executive action and regulation is imperative, right? Like clean car standards. Oh my gosh, we could have been so far ahead in the deployment of clean cars. It's almost silly that you can still go into a car dealership and buy a combustion vehicle. Like, it is just unbelievable to me. That type of thing where Biden says, look, we're going to sign an executive order to have 50% of all new passenger vehicles by 2030 be electric. That's a big game changer, right? In terms of spawning the market and sending a market signal, and then to have the funding come along with it as an accelerator to those regulations is huge. It's carrot and stick. It's a standard practice. I think where there's a lot more movement, it is what Julia was talking about in building codes, right? Mandates for statewide building codes, even a national clean electricity plan. Those types of things matter to us. And I will say, and again, this is back to some of your reporting, we're up against major lobbying in the fossil fuel industry. So I'm telling you, the disinformation is really impacting local policy. So a neighboring community tried to pass some building codes, and an offshoot of the fossil fuel industry, the oil and gas industry, created some Facebook looking like groups that spread misinformation. And then, those types of building codes don't get passed because people are confused about the cost of electrification. These things are impacting our communities. And so I think there needs to be some type of reckoning that, like, we have to ensure that the lobbying and the Congress is, the feds are talking sort of both sides, right? They're accelerating this movement. It's really exciting. And they're still allowing for fossil fuel development at the same time. And they're still allowing for the industry to get away with this stuff. It has to be regulated. There has to be components of this that say that this is not okay, right? Like, you're not allowed to do this anymore. And I love the movements, like beyond regulation. I love like the grassroots movements that are saying, no way. Like, for example, the movements that are stopping some of the PR firms that are backing fossil fuel industry, right? That's cool. Like, let's stop the PR firms that are playing a role in spreading that disinformation. So I know I'm going all over the place, but I absolutely think it's essential. If we're going to have real, movement in the climate space, we have to end corporate money in politics. I see that as a huge solution to better democracy and for climate legislation, and that includes regulation.
Yeah, disinformation is just this. I do a lot of reporting there, and that's really interesting of how you see this, especially around building codes. Luis, I'm just curious, have you seen anything like this in terms of disinformation campaigns or fossil fuel lobbying in Ithaca?
Oh man, like all over the place. It was really funny. I was at home the other day, and somebody came in, knocked on my door with a flyer telling me why the Ithaca Green New Deal sucks. And it was like, I entertained the question. I was like, oh, well, tell me all about it. And then he started telling me about all of these, communists that came to town and, came with these ideas. And, I mean, I know we're not talking about that, but I need to say it. Part of the message was, these guys that come from south of the border that decided to implement these new ideas. And I was like, dude, Mexican here. But it was just so weird. And this is very progressive Ithaca. And, you still have campaigns of misinformation that are rooted in racism, for example, and discrimination. And it's unbelievable to see that. It's everywhere. And we need to act on it. I mean, I absolutely agree that there is a need to do something about it, to combat this. And, it's very difficult. I mean, we're talking about, the declaration of a climate emergency. And all of these policy instruments are very important, and we need to handle it with care. I mean, we need to be very responsible when we do that. There has to be a plan behind a climate emergency, and that is when you exhaust all other possibilities. So even though I do believe we live in a climate emergency, the declaration of a climate emergency, activating, a national emergency act for the president to take on some powers over Congress. I mean, that is a very complicated matter. And I really think that right now, I mean, I know it's crazy. I'm a climate nerd, but I don't believe we are at the point where the president needs to declare a climate emergency. I think that will come very likely once November happens. But I think right now there are other tools that we can use that we need to exhaust before we go there. So I know it's not a popular thing to say, but that's what I think.
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead, Rebecca.
No, jump in.
Well, so the other hat I wear at USDN is communications, and so in my previous life I did a lot of work on like social good communications campaigns, for environment, climate change, clean energy, land, water, etc. And in that role, and also here with USDN, we see that a ton. I mean, I see that all the time, running trainings and workshops, the disinformation, the struggle that folks have to communicate. And I appreciate Susie and Louise talking about this, that like there is the whole cultural conversation around it has made things really challenging. And at the local level, that comes out a lot, where folks are trying to explain this. And then a lot of times, like, the incredible sustainability staff don't always have all the tools needed to like wage a complex PR campaign to explain why whatever they're doing is actually going to really help everybody out. But then they can get outspent by lobbying groups with, astroturf campaigns or other things, or even just like, doing simple projects. Sometimes you need a lot of these resources to really meet people where they are. And so the whole communications piece and actually connecting with people and having conversations, like having conversations with your neighbor, having conversations in your community groups, at your schools, places of worship, like wherever people are congregating, to talk to each other about like what's happening in our communities and what does this mean and how do these policies actually make people's lives better in a concrete way is so important, so that it's real and that people can connect with it and understand it. And that takes a ton of time, and it takes effort, and it takes resources. But there, the more you scale up, the more you can, and the more ambitious or controversial potentially that cities are trying to be, the more likely they're going to become a target for the oil and gas industry or for other industries to then pour a bunch of money and create a community group and then do everything they can to shut it down. And it happens a lot. And we just don't, I don't know who to call to get the money to help folks combat that, but that would probably be really helpful too.
So that's a great segue to a question I always like to ask, which is we have very knowledgeable people here attending, but what you think, talking to concerned citizens, what's some practical advice for the ways people can and should be supporting local action on climate change? Would love to get each of you briefly on what you would advise. Why don't we?
I can give a 2 second. Sorry, yeah. I can give just really 2 seconds. Literally, one, talk to people. Surveys show people think other people don't care. They care, but they don't think anybody else cares. Not true. Most people care. Talk to them. Talk about why you care. Talk about what's happening. That actually makes a huge difference. Talk. And number 2, do what lights you up. We need everybody involved. So if you're an artist, if you're an organizer, if you do spreadsheets, if you're an accountant, I don't care what you do, we need you. So check out what's going on in your community, sign up, meet up, and go do the thing. That's what I would say.
Nice and concise. Susie, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, it's great that you said that, because there's this great Venn diagram that Ayanna Johnson put together, and I'm sure many of you have seen it. Basically, she's a brilliant climate scientist in media. She talks about how we need everyone with any type of skill that you already have: communication, PR, marketing, visuals, creatives, whatever, filmmakers, impact investors, therapists. I need lots of therapists. And bringing those skill sets to the climate movement. We don't need climate scientists. We don't need more. Well, we need a lot more of Luis and Julia and Rebecca, but what we really need are the people that have honed already these skills and transferring them and joining local or national organizations to see how you can put those skills to the climate movement. And I've seen so many amazing people come to this movement with these types of new skills that I don't have, that have done wonders at accelerating Boulder County's initiatives, just adding their input, adding their insights. I'd also say, and I know this is like sort of one of those answers that you want to roll your eyes and feel free, but I think participating in our democracy is important. Electing local climate champions is extremely important. Electing state climate champions, electing climate treasurers, state treasurers that are climate friendly, looking at divestment, and not just divestment in the way that we traditionally think about it, but like looking at, for those early adopters who are really, oh, I'm going to buy a Tesla, I'm going to do this. No, what you should really do is look at where you're holding your assets and where you're banking, and look at where those are tied to fossil fuel industries, and look at where you can support the clean energy economy and the transformational shift that we need with your money. And so I think, we matter in this. I sometimes think that individuals, action is futile in this grand crisis, but I do think we can be a part of the transformational system change in those ways.
And it sucks to follow Susie after she drops the mic like that.
Sorry.
It's like what do I say that sounds smart now, right? So I think what we do is, what I do is, tell people to, read up on things, be informed. If you care, be informed. And also always establish a conversation with somebody, not only with your friends or people that already believe in this, try to talk to, people who disagree with you. And for example, we have this program called 1000 Conversations with the Community. And the idea is to have, 1000 conversations, that are meaningful and that really reflect what the community feels. But in there, we always tell people, like, don't assume that what the other person thinks or feels about climate change is hardwired into their brain. There's a reason why they think that way, and we need to understand that reason. Once we understand each other through conversation, we can, establish what type of action we can all agree on and then take on the climate crisis. So it would be that, read up on it, talk to people, understand people, make an effort.
That was great. I feel inspired by a lot of those comments. It's been a rough summer, but I just wanted to say thank you to our host, Institute for Policy Studies, for this really lively discussion. I learned a lot here, and thank you again to our panelists for such a comprehensive talk about what's happening here. So I'll turn it over to John, but thank you. And thanks also for the really thoughtful comments and questions from our audience.
And for everybody, you have to read up on what Rebecca has done, because she's a superstar and the way she writes is amazing. So it had to be said, Rebecca, sorry.
It's absolutely true. Thank you, Luis. I was going to say that myself. Thank you, Rebecca, for moderating this panel and for all the great journalism you've been doing that has informed our discussion and informed our knowledge about what's going on here. I want to thank the panelists. You all have been fabulous. This has been not only inspiring, but also just a comprehensive look at what the federal legislation that's coming down the pike is what kind of impact it's going to have, and what's happening at a local level, and what we can as individuals do, what talents we can bring to bear to this movement, to this grand transformation that we're all a part of. This event will be available as both Facebook Live. So if you go to the Institute for Policy Studies Facebook page, you can find it there. We'll also put it up at YouTube, and we'll produce an article as well that we'll have published in various places. So this conversation will continue. And I just, again, want to thank all of the panelists and as well all the participants who've provided some really sharp and insightful comments in the chat. And we look forward to seeing you at future Institute for Policy Studies events.